This is my graduate risk assessment by Amy Sidran. The purpose of a risk assessment: to determine the hazard of a substance, potential exposure, and likelihood of adverse effects. The risk assessment is estimating the probability of harm, basically hazard identification, array of potential adverse effects, then dose-response relationships, what dose causes no effect, along with the exposure assessment, the expected dose from product use and environmental residues. Then that is a risk characterization, relationship between hazard and the exposure, the probability of harm. The history of Lorsban 4E, it's a chlorpyrifos, is a broad spectrum chlorinated organophosphate insecticide that was first registered in 1965 to control foliage and soil-borne insect pests on a variety of feed and crops. Today, 21 to 24 million pounds are applied annually in the United States. Approximately 11 million of those pounds are applied in non-agricultural settings, houses. I'll go into that later. There are 800 registered products containing chlorpyrifos on the market. Like I said, it's a group 1 organophosphate. I also read that it was a Kramer class 3, which means that it has a threshold of toxicological concern. This is the breakdown of what is actually in Lorsban. The formulation types come in many different ways. You have wettable powder, emulsifiable concentrate, dust, granular, bait, flowable concentrate, impregnated material, pelleted or tableted, pressurized liquid, microencapsulated. There are many ways that you can buy Lorsban. The typical usage: it's a broad spectrum insecticide. It controls a wide variety of insects. I was pretty amazed by that, from cutworms, wireworms, to aphids. As of 2016, it was the largest agricultural crops it was used on was corn at 26%. It was also a high average percent of Brussels sprouts, 73%, cranberries 46%, apples 44%, broccoli 41%, and cauliflower at 31%, along with a variety of other trees and nuts. Today, the highest use states include California, Washington, Georgia, Florida, Arizona, and others. Typical usage continued. The foliar application may be applied by either ground or aerial equipment. It's often used as a pre- and post-emergent treatment for insect control, used in sprinkler irrigation systems as post-emergent for foliar insects. Some of the non-agricultural uses are golf courses, turf, greenhouses, non-structural wood treatments. The largest non-agricultural market in terms of total pounds applied are termite control and turf. It was also registered as a mosquito adulticide. It's also used for roach and bait stations. The hazard information for Lorsban is that it's moderately toxic following acute oral, dermal, and inhalation exposure. Most exposure routes include food residue, drinking water, dust from farm fields, also inhalation. I found that a lot of the exposure comes from inhalation inside of structures where the wood has been treated or had been treating using Lorsban. The toxicity category 2, Kramer class of toxicological concern. It's a cholinesterase inhibitor, which negatively affects the nervous system, although that has been updated, that it's also an endocrine disruptor. This blocked enzyme is needed by our brains to control acetylcholine, one of the neurotransmitters mediating communication between nervous cells. I found a lot of information out there on how important CHE is. Some basic common exposure symptoms that people might experience: nausea, dizziness, confusion, respiratory paralysis if it's in very high exposure, and then death if it's really high as well. The risk characterization, as you can see from this chart, has an oral LD50, 66 milligrams per kilogram. Mammals, the dermal is 1250 milligrams per kilogram per body weight. And then the RFD, acute reference dose, 0.005 milligrams per kilograms per day. This chart talks about the points of departure, toxicological doses, and toxicity endpoints for apparent chlorpyrifos, use in dietary exposure. The QRFD is 0.0036. in the general population. And then chronic dietary had been the RFD of 0.0003 milligrams per kilogram per day. The updated summary of doses and endpoints selected for chlorpyrifos risk assessment. This was an EPA document. The acute dietary on NOEL was 0.5. And then the chronic dietary NOEL, or no adverse, was 0.03. This one was updated recently as well by the EPA. It has been updated since its registration. It's pretty controversial right now, as we had discussed. As you can see that the inhalation NOAEL is 0.1, the oral is 0.03, long-term inhalation is 0.03. The exposure assessment as of 2011, the chlorpyrifos-based point of departure, the POD, was 0.0036 milligrams per kilogram per day on all population subgroups. And then the chronic analysis was 0.0003 milligrams per kilogram per day. Recently, the EPA data has been updated as they've been in the re-review process. I think that's what it's called. So I was saying the re-registration eligibility decision since 2003 has made the EPA go back and just keep refining the registration or the registration information on chlorpyrifos. The EPA food and risk estimate as of 2016 with steady state dietary food only exposure and risk estimates for chlorpyrifos are in this chart. For infants, 0.20, and then children 0.17, youths 0.12, adult females 0.12, and you can see from the rest of the chart. This other chart, this is dietary exposure and where we would actually be seeing exposure for food in food crops, anything from oranges, tangerines, to apples, and that the chronic exposure at 0.0004 parts per million is pretty low. And now the EPA has set the tolerance of 0.1 residue allow on food commodities. So these exposure numbers are pretty slow compared to what the EPA is now saying the tolerance is at. Some of the human health issues that with chlorpyrifos are that it's highly toxic by ingestion, that it's a carcinogen, there's skin irritant, respiratory tract. They have changed that from a cholinesterase inhibitor to neurodevelopmental as they have expanded their research. The EPA industry data on risk of lorsban. It was banned in 2000 for use in most household settings. Today, it's still in use on and around 40,000 farms and on about 50 different crops, ranging from apples to almonds. EPA scientists concluded that the exposure to the chemical has been in use since 1965 was potentially causing significant health consequences, as per a New York Times article in 2017. It's still going through the re-registration eligibility decision. The common pesticide disturbs brains of children. There's a lot of research about how it is affecting neurodevelopment. This research article that I found was on human health risks of lorsban. In 2001, EPA itself used scientific article Brain Anomalies in Children Exposed to Common Organophosphate Pesticides. The article describes how human health impact from prenatal exposure and exposure to young children from heavy agricultural use areas, or even just general population through CPF-treated products, such as wood products in a daycare center, can have neurodevelopmental toxicity impacts on development of children. The exposure that they tested in this research article was well below the threshold of system toxicity levels. This was also detectable levels in amniotic fluid and in the placenta. In this research article, the results that they saw were smaller head size, lower birth rate, deviant neonatal reflexes, attention problems, neurodevelopmental anomalies associated with developmental disorders, and also lower IQ. Some EPA actions that they have taken based on their own research and research within the community of scientists has that they have eliminated all homeowner use except ant and roach baits in 2000. The termiticide was phased out. In 2000, they required all uses of chlorpyrifos products in the U.S. be continued on tomatoes. Then on apples was restricted to pre-bloom and dormant application. 2002, in 2012, they had limited the use of chlorpyrifos. The most recent EPA updates are that as of 2015, they had revoked all food residue tolerances, although the most recent EPA data that I found for 2016 showed that they were saying that 0.1 parts per million residue allowed on food commodities, as stated in their most recent risk assessment document that I could find. The EPA does not think there is a large risk from exposure to chlorpyrifos from food, but when that exposure is combined with estimated exposure from drinking water in certain watersheds, the EPA cannot conclude that the risk from potential aggregate exposure meets the FFDCA safety standards. So they have taken it upon themselves to to make sure that all of the levels that are safe for human exposure from drinking water and also in food commodities.